Greetings. We left off last time talking about diffusion and osmosis. I want to continue this with a discussion of how things get in and out of a cell. So, osmosis, diffusion are passive transport. This is the transport of solutes in and out of a cell using diffusion. So the diffusion of water across a semi-permeable membrane, which is osmosis, or the diffusion, simple diffusion, the diffusion of like salt across a membrane. That's passive transport. Now, active transport is a different process. Active transport utilizes ATP typically to power transport. Active transport allows things to go from low concentration to high concentration. This is against entropy, right? This allows a cell to have different concentrations in the membrane than without. Because remember, passive transport like diffusion, you're going to reach equilibrium at some point. But active transport allows you to maintain homeostasis, a different concentration inside the cell of something than outside a cell. You'll see active transport, for example, in sharks. Sharks will pump salt out of their gills all the time because they absorb it all day long thanks to diffusion, but they have to get rid of it, and they pump it back out into the ocean. Now, let me just show you, this is an example of two kinds of proteins involved in passive transport, in diffusion, or osmosis. So here's a channel protein. A channel protein is an integral protein that's in a membrane that allows for polar substances to pass through. So there's no energy involved. It's just simple diffusion or osmosis. So this could be an aquaporine that allows water through, or it could be some other kind of tunnel that allows the diffusion of a substance. Now, another kind of protein involved in diffusion is a carrier protein. Carrier proteins are kind of like a door. They open and shut, but they open in response to the solute that they transport. So they don't actually need energy, because when the solute sticks in here, it causes hydrogen bonds and things to change in the protein, and the protein opens up and shuts. So that's a carrier protein. Now, active transport like this, this is an example of something known as the sodium potassium pump. Okay, the sodium potassium pump uses ATP to run, so this is not passive, this is active transport. So what the sodium potassium pump does is it binds with sodium ions. See these ions here? 3 sodium. It'll hook to 3 sodium ions. Now notice everything that's going on in this picture. This is the cytoplasm down here, and in the cytoplasm we have a high concentration of sodium, a low concentration of sodium and a high concentration of potassium. And ATP comes in this case, and a phosphate group breaks off. That's going to change the shape of the protein and power it, and it's going to pump sodium out of the cell, where sodium is already in a high concentration. So notice sodium is in a high concentration up here outside of the cell. So we're pumping sodium to where it is already in a high concentration, and then it's going to bind to potassium, and it's going to move the other way, and it's going to bring 2 potassium into the cell, which is already high in potassium. So we're pumping sodium to where it's high, and we're pumping potassium to where it's high. We're pumping against a concentration gradient. This is like pushing a car uphill. It takes a lot of energy to do this. Now, we do this all the time. A lot of our cellular energy is spent running sodium potassium pumps, because this is how we build a charge in a neuron. You know, in our nerves, that I didn't even spell that right. In our neuron, this is how we maintain a charge to generate an electrical signal in our nerves, by having different amounts of positive ions inside and outside of our cells. So here's another image of this. Sodium potassium pumps, remember, they bind to 3 sodiums and pump them out, and they pump in potassium using the power of ATP. All right, so let's just then talk about the 3 basic kinds of transport we've been talking about. Passive transport, this is simple diffusion. That's when ions cross a membrane. Okay. There's another kind of diffusion, I didn't define it yet, so now's the time, called facilitated diffusion. That's when a protein is used to allow molecules to cross a membrane. Okay, and those could be carrier proteins like we see here, or just channel proteins like we see there, like we've seen in that previous slide. That's facilitated. That's when a protein is involved. Once again, simple basic diffusion is when a molecule crosses the membrane directly. I often refer to that as simple diffusion. Active transport is when we use a pump that's powered by ATP and we move things against their concentration gradient. So that's another way that we get things into or out of a cell, using proteins either to allow them to diffuse across the membrane if they're like big polar substances. So if a substance is too big to cross a membrane or too polar, a protein might be involved. And if you want to move things against their concentration gradient, you're going to need to use a pump like the sodium potassium pump, and to do that you'll need to use ATP. When we continue our lecture, we're going to talk about other kinds of pumps, and actually let me end with this one. Another kind of pump, we're going to talk about this pump, and I think in the next lecture we'll talk about bulk transport is what we'll end up doing. But here's an example of another kind of pump, one that you may have seen already. This is found in mitochondria and in chloroplasts. It's a proton pump. It utilizes ATP to pump hydrogen ions, which are protons, against their concentration gradient, putting a high concentration of hydrogen ions on one side of a membrane and leaving them lower on the other side of the membrane. And if you've learned about cellular respiration or photosynthesis, you'll know that that's vital for the production of ATP. We'll pick up with this lecture. Next time we'll talk about bulk transport.